The obsidian palace rose above the city like a monument to eternal night. Its spires pierced the violet sky, and its windows glowed with cold blue light that never flickered or faded. Within those walls, the most powerful vampire dynasty in recorded history conducted its affairs with precision and ancient grace. Servants moved through marble corridors without sound. Guards stood at every threshold, their eyes reflecting centuries of loyalty. Everything functioned as it should, perfect and unchanging, as it had for 1,000 years. Everything except one small matter that had begun to crack the foundation of that perfection. Princess Alara had stopped eating. In the human world, a child refusing meals might warrant concern, perhaps a visit to a physician or a conversation about preferences. But in the vampire realm, where consumption was tied to strength, to lineage, to the very continuation of bloodline power, a royal refusing sustenance was more than troubling. It was a crisis whispered about in shadowed corners and discussed in emergency councils held behind sealed doors. The king had summoned the finest culinary masters from across the empire. They arrived with their crystal vessels and ancient recipes, their rare ingredients harvested from places humans had never seen. Each chef presented their work with trembling hands and hopeful eyes, knowing that success meant honor beyond measure and failure meant nothing more than dismissal from the palace, but dismissal from the presence of the vampire king was its own kind of ending. One by one, they failed. The princess would look at each plate with those silver-grey eyes that held none of the predatory gleam common to her kind, only something quiet and unreachable. She would shake her head once, almost imperceptibly, and turn away. No explanation. No complaint. Just silence that grew heavier with each passing day. The palace staff whispered when they thought no one could hear. The princess was ill. The princess was cursed. The princess had inherited some flaw from her mother's bloodline. May her memory rest in shadow. The theories multiplied like echoes in an empty chamber, each more elaborate than the last, and none of them true. King Aldrich watched his daughter fade like candlelight in a cold room, and for the first time in his immortal existence, he felt the particular helplessness of loving something he could not command to heal. On the evening of the Crimson Moon gathering, when the highest nobles of the vampire courts assembled to discuss matters of territory and tradition, the palace required additional staff to serve the influx of guests. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the presence of humans among the temporary workers, brought in from the border districts where species occasionally mingled in cautious coexistence. Marin was 23 years old and unremarkable by any standard that mattered in this world. She had no supernatural gifts, no noble connections, no particular beauty that might catch an immortal eye. What she had was a need to earn enough coin to send to her younger brother, who was studying medicine in a human city 3 days' travel from the palace. What she had was a mother who had taught her to see people, really see them, before that mother had closed her eyes for the last time 2 winters ago. The agency that placed her warned her to be invisible. Serve quickly. Speak only when spoken to. Do not meet the eyes of any vampire above servant rank. Survive the night, collect the payment, return home. Marin had intended to follow every instruction. It was during her fourth circuit of the hall that she noticed the girl sitting alone at the edge of the raised platform where the king's table stood. Princess Alara looked nothing like what Marin had imagined when she heard whispers about the vampire king's daughter. She was small, perhaps appearing 12 or 13 by human standards, though who knew what that meant in immortal years. Her gown was silk the color of midnight, and her hair fell past her shoulders in waves of ash blonde that seemed perpetually touched by moonlight. She sat with perfect posture, as she had surely been taught, but her hands were folded too tightly in her lap. Her shoulders curved inward just slightly. Her eyes moved across the room without landing on anything, like a bird searching for somewhere safe to rest and finding only thorns. Before her sat a plate of extraordinary craftsmanship. The food upon it had been arranged with geometric precision, a culinary sculpture that probably cost more than Marin's entire yearly earnings. The princess had not touched it. Steam no longer rose from its surface. It had gone cold while she sat there, untasting, unseen by all the nobles who laughed and negotiated around her. Marin should have looked away. She should have continued her work, invisible as instructed, thinking only of payment and survival. Instead, she watched. She watched as a servant approached the princess with what appeared to be a different dish, more elaborate than the last. She watched the subtle flinch in the girl's expression, so small that someone not paying attention would miss it entirely. She watched the princess shake her head once, that same gentle refusal, and the servant retreat with poorly hidden frustration. She watched as King Aldrich glanced toward his daughter from across the hall, and in that glance, Marin saw something that surprised her. Not anger. Not the cold displeasure of a ruler whose child was embarrassing him before his court. She saw grief. The serving shift rotated Marin through the kitchens near midnight, where she was tasked with carrying empty trays back for washing. The cooking staff moved in careful choreography, still preparing dishes that might tempt the princess, still failing to understand why nothing worked. Marin set down her tray and paused near the doorway, listening. The bluefin was rejected, one chef murmured to another. And the crystallized heart broth. His Majesty's patience wears thin. Perhaps she requires something from her mother's homeland, the other suggested. Something we cannot source. Her mother's homeland is ash and memory. There is nothing to source. Marin thought about the princess's hands, folded too tightly. The way she flinched before the servant even finished approaching. The eyes that searched for somewhere safe to land. She thought about her own brother, in the months after their mother died. How he had sat at the table staring at meals she prepared with desperate love, unable to eat despite his hunger. Not because the food was wrong, but because eating meant accepting. Meant continuing. Meant being present in a world that had become too heavy to bear. It hadn't been the quality of the meals that eventually helped him. It had been the evening she sat beside him and said nothing, demanded nothing, simply shared the space and waited until he was ready to return to himself. Marin knew she should not be thinking these thoughts about a vampire princess. She should not be drawing comparisons between her fragile human brother and the daughter of the most powerful creature in the empire. The situations were nothing alike. The species were nothing alike. And yet, the girl at the edge of that platform looked exactly like someone trying to disappear, while everyone insisted she perform. Later, Maren would not be able to explain exactly what moved her. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother's hands, gentle on her shoulders, teaching her that kindness required no permission. Perhaps it was the look on the king's face, that ancient grief that transcended what species should have been capable of feeling. Perhaps it was simply that the night was long, and she was tired of being invisible, and somewhere in her ordinary human heart, she could not bear to walk past someone who was slowly choosing to fade away. The kitchen held ingredients for staff meals separate from the royal preparations. Simple things. Honest things. Bread that had been baked that morning. Honey from hives kept in the palace gardens. A small ceramic pot that could be warmed over a low flame. Maren found what she needed and began to work. She did not craft a sculpture. She did not arrange anything with geometric precision. She heated water and steeped herbs that would have made any royal chef shudder with their commonness, then added honey until the mixture glowed amber in the dim light. She toasted bread until it was golden but not quite crisp, then spread it with something soft and pale that smelled like comfort itself. The meal she assembled would not have impressed anyone. It was the sort of thing a human mother might make for a sick child, the sort of thing that said nothing except "I am here and I see you and none of this has to be so hard." She placed it on a simple wooden tray that had no business entering the gathering hall. A kitchen supervisor saw her moving toward the door and called out sharply, "You cannot serve that. What are you doing? That is not approved for royal consumption." "Then it won't be royal consumption," Maren said, more calmly than she felt. "It will just be food. For someone who looks like they need it." She did not wait for permission. The walk from the kitchen to the gathering hall took perhaps 90 seconds. To Maren, it felt like crossing between worlds. Every step carried her further from safety, deeper into territory where a human had no right to act on instinct or compassion. The guards at the entrance looked at her tray with confusion but did not stop her. She was still wearing servant's attire. She was still clearly starved. What could she possibly be doing that warranted intervention? The hall had grown quieter as the night deepened. Many nobles had withdrawn to private discussions. The platform where the king sat was occupied only by a handful of advisers and, at its far edge, still alone, still untouching the cold, elaborate plate before her, the princess. Maren approached without hurrying. She stopped beside the table and did something that every protocol in the palace forbade. She looked directly at the princess's face. She met those silver-gray eyes that had been searching for somewhere safe to land. "I made this," Maren said quietly. "Not for any reason. Not because anyone told me to. I just thought you might be tired of being served things that were meant to impress you." She set the wooden tray down beside the crystal plate, its simplicity almost absurd in comparison. "You don't have to eat it," Maren continued. "You don't have to do anything. But it's warm, and it's real, and no one's watching to see if it meets some standard you never asked to carry." For a moment, Nothing happened. The princess looked at the simple meal, the tea in its common cup, the humble toast, the absence of any pressure or expectation, and something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically. Not with the suddenness of transformation. Just a softening, like ice beginning to remember that it was once water. She reached for the toast. The movement was so small that the nobles nearby did not notice. But Marin noticed. And from across the hall, where he had been pretending to focus on a conversation with his advisors, King Aldrich noticed. The princess brought the toast to her lips. She bit. She chewed. She swallowed. And then, with a slowness that spoke of relearning something her body had forgotten, she took another bite. And another. She lifted the tea and drank, her eyes closing briefly as the warmth spread through her. When she opened them again, there were no tears, but there was something present in her gaze that had been absent before. She finished the meal. Every bite. Every drop. The crystal plate of elaborate food sat untouched beside the empty wooden tray, a silent testimony to something that transcended culinary skill. King Aldrich rose from his seat. The hall, which had already been quiet, went completely still. Every vampire in attendance turned to watch as their ruler stepped down from the platform and walked, with slow, deliberate paces, toward the place where a human servant stood beside his daughter. Marin felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no idea what punishment awaited someone who bypassed every royal protocol to serve the princess unapproved food. She had acted on instinct, on the strange certainty that it was right, and now she would face whatever consequences that certainty had earned her. The king stopped before her. He was tall, taller than any human she had ever seen, and his presence carried the weight of centuries. His eyes were dark as ancient ink, and they studied her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously invisible and completely known. "What is your name?" His voice was deep, measured, carrying no obvious threat but no warmth either. "Marin, your Majesty." "Marin." He tasted the syllables like an unfamiliar wine. "You served my daughter food from the staff kitchen. Unapproved. Unannounced. Prepared by your own hands." "Yes, your Majesty." "Why?" Marin understood that this question might determine whether she left the palace alive. She also understood that anything less than truth would be pointless before a creature who had lived long enough to recognize lies in their infancy. Because she looked like someone who needed to be seen, Amarin said. Not performed for. Not impressed at. Just seen. And I know what that feels like. So I made something that was real instead of something that was expected. The king was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to look at his daughter. Princess Alara sat with her hands resting loosely in her lap now, no longer gripping each other in that too tight fold. Her posture had softened. Her eyes, when she raised them to meet her father's gaze, held something that might have been the beginning of return. She was kind, Irlara said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken aloud in weeks. not because she wanted anything, just because she chose to be. The king closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, Marin saw the grief still there, but changed now, tempered with something new. The entire empire brought its finest offerings to my daughter's table, he said slowly. Masters of their craft. Centuries of tradition. Every conceivable luxury. And she turned away from all of it. He paused. Because none of them saw her. They saw an opportunity. A duty. A problem to be solved. They did not see a child who was overwhelmed and alone. He looked at Marin again. You saw her. You, who have no power in this world, who entered my palace for a single night's wage, who could have remained invisible and safe. You saw what I should have seen weeks ago. Marin did not know what to say to that, so she remained silent. My daughter has not eaten in 3 weeks, the king continued, his voice dropping lower. She has weakened. She has withdrawn. I have watched her fade and could not understand why. I commanded solutions when I should have offered presents. I demanded answers when I should have simply sat beside her. He reached out slowly, giving Marin time to step back if she wished, and rested his hand briefly on her shoulder. His touch was cool but not cold. Careful, as if he had not touched a human in a very long time and wished not to frighten her. What you gave my daughter tonight cannot be repaid with coin or precision. But I will try. His dark eyes held hers. You will remain in the palace, if you choose. Not as a servant. As a guest. You will be protected and provided for. Your brother's education will be funded until its completion. And when you wish to leave, you will leave freely, with resources to build whatever life you desire. Marin blinked. Your Majesty, I only made toast and tea. No. His voice was gentle now, gentler than she would have believed possible from the feared ruler of the vampire empire. You reminded me that power is not always the answer. That sometimes what is needed is something far simpler and far more rare. He stepped back. Kindness, he said. Offered without expectation. Given without fear. He looked at his daughter, and his ancient face softened into something almost human. That is what heals. That is what protects. I have commanded armies. I have ended dynasties. And I could not do what you did tonight with bread and honey and a wooden tray. In the weeks that followed, Marin did remain in the palace, though she never felt quite comfortable being called a guest. She preferred the gardens, where night-blooming flowers opened under the eternal twilight and small creatures that were neither entirely natural nor entirely magical moved through the shadows without fear. She preferred the library, where she could read histories written by hands long turned to dust and understand better the world she had stumbled into. And she preferred the evenings when Princess Ilara would find her, settling into a chair nearby with a book of her own, saying nothing at first. Just being present. Just sharing space. Slowly, the princess began to eat again. Not the elaborate meals that the royal kitchens continued to produce, but simpler things. Things that reminded her of the night when a stranger had looked at her and seen not a problem, not a legacy, not a failing daughter of a powerful king, just a lonely girl who needed someone to notice she was drowning. The king did not command or demand. He began to visit his daughter without agenda, sitting beside her in silence, learning the lesson that Marin had taught without meaning to teach anything at all. That presence was sometimes more powerful than power. That listening was sometimes more valuable than solutions. Marin's brother completed his medical training and opened a small clinic in a town on the border where humans and others lived cautiously side by side. He never fully understood how his sister had gone from serving trays in a vampire palace to being treated as a permanent guest of the crown, but he learned not to question gifts that came from unexpected places. As for Marin, she found something she had not known she was looking for. A purpose that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with connection. She became, in her quiet way, a bridge. A reminder to those who had lived too long and accumulated too much power that the simplest acts of seeing and being seen were still the foundation of everything that mattered. On the anniversary of that first night, Princess Alara brought Marin a gift, a small ceramic pot, delicately crafted, sized perfectly for brewing tea for two. "I wanted you to know," the princess said softly, "that you saved me. Not with magic or power or ancient wisdom. Just with bread and kindness and the willingness to look at me when everyone else was looking away." Marin accepted the pot with hands that trembled only slightly. "I didn't do anything special," she said. "I just made what my mother used to make for me, when everything felt too heavy." The princess smiled, a true smile, no longer the ghost of one, and settled into her chair. "That," she said, "is exactly what made it special." Outside the window, the eternal twilight softened to something almost warm. Somewhere in the garden, a creature sang a melody that sounded like the beginning of a story rather than the end of one. And in the heart of the obsidian palace, where power had reigned for 1,000 years unchallenged, something gentler had taken root. Not weakness. Never weakness. Just the quiet truth that even the strongest walls needed windows, and even the oldest darkness could learn to welcome a single, humble light.